This time I'm going to analyse rook against pawn. This is a game I had in the Fornciel against Lawrence Webb. He's an experienced relay master and is very good at endgames, so I knew it's quite difficult to make progress in this ending. I was going to have to sacrifice a pawn on the king side and try and march my king over to the queen side. Black played rook to a1. I played king to d4, and black moved his rook back to f1, trying to attack my f-pawn. His idea is after rook to c3, I have to play rook to a1. He can play rook to a1, attacking my a4 pawn, so I have to sacrifice the f-pawn. At this point, my opponent made quite a cheeky offer to me. He told me that he had to go and catch a train, and did I want to agree a draw? I thought to myself, that's not a very good deal, as I've got rook and 4 against rook and 3, so I declined his generous offer and played king to c5. Black plays rook takes f3, and now I play king to b5. So I've lost the f-pawn, and I'm going to lose the g-pawn as well, and probably the e-pawn too, but I'm going to create a passed a-pawn. At some point, black will have to sacrifice his rook for the passed a-pawn, and with his f-pawn, he's going to have to try and push his f-pawn far enough down the board to win my rook for his f-pawn. So let's see how the game developed. Black played now king to g5. King takes a5. King takes g4. I played king to b5. King to b6 would allow rook to b3 check. It doesn't make a big difference, but I didn't want to allow this. And he plays pawn to f5 to exchange off my e-pawn. If I play pawn to e5 now, then his f-pawn is further advanced. So I want to play e takes f5 check. And after king takes f5, we have a race on. White's going to try and promote his pawn and get a queen. Black at some point would have to sacrifice his rook for that pawn. Then black's going to try and push his own f-pawn down the board, and white would have to sacrifice his rook for the f-pawn. White's hoping that he can promote to a queen and get his king back in time so that his rook and king can stop the black f-pawn. So I played here a5. He played rook to e3, trying to bring his rook back to e8 to stop me from promoting to a queen. I played pawn to a6. Now in this position he made a key mistake. There's only one way to defend this endgame. It's very difficult, but black can actually achieve a draw in this position. The way to achieve a draw is to remember this one point. When you have a rook against a pawn in an ending, you really want to have your king on the same side as your opponent's king, blocking off his route back towards your pawn. We saw this in the game Belajar against Shirov. The king was blocking the opponent's king from coming back towards the pawn. In this position, black played king to g5. This is actually the losing move. The only way for black to defend this endgame is very complicated, but if you know the basic principles, you could probably work it out. The way to defend the endgame would be to play rook back to e8. Now white plays pawn to a7, and again there's only one more drawing move. Black ideally wants to move his king to e5. He wants to bring his king to the e file and then start pushing the f pawn. He doesn't want to go to the g file. If he does try and play king e5 on this move, however, he loses, because after king e5, white can play rook to c7. And now if black plays pawn to f5, white can play rook to e7 check and reach queen against rook and pawn. And as we've discussed before, with the pawn off the 7th rank, this is a winning position for white. So going back a couple of moves, black's best move now is to play rook to a8. And after this move, white can play king to b6, and he'll win black's rook for his pawn. But now black can play king to e5. And the king on e5 is very strong because it's going to shoulder the white king from coming back and stopping the black f-pawn. It's always good to bring your king into the action. In this variation, black was able to bring his king to the e-file, and that would allow him to get a draw. If he had to move his king to the g-file, then he won't be able to draw, and we'll see how that happened in the game. So let's have a look at what happens with the king on e5. White now plays king to b7. Black plays rook takes a7 check. And white plays king takes a7. Black's actually lost a tempo in this game compared to the actual proper game, because when the king got to b7, the black rook was already on A8 and under attack. But even though black lost a tempo, it's worth that tempo to have the king on E5 instead of the king on G5. So now black could play F5, king to B6, F4, king to C5, F3. It's always worth remembering it's better to push your pawn first and your king second in rook and pawn against rook endgames, because you want your pawn as far down the board as possible. Now after rook to C1, black can play king to E4, and the white king can't approach the pawn because the black king is keeping it away. So for example, king to C4, pawn to F2, again pushing the pawn first, and this is an equal position. Next black's going to play king to E3, king to E2, and then promote to a queen. And white's going to have to sacrifice his rook for the queen. So this is actually a drawn position. So going back to the position in the game, instead of playing rook E8 to A8, black plays king to G5. And this is a big mistake because the king is now moving away from the centre of the board. And this means eventually the white king will be able to come back and stop the f-pawn. So white now plays pawn to A7. Black played rook to E8. I played a bit of an unusual move here, rook to B4, with some ideas of rook to B8. As it turns out, it doesn't make any difference if I play this move or king to B6, because the tempo I spend by playing rook to B4, black's going to have to give that tempo back, because when I move my king to C6, I'll be threatening rook to B8, and the black rook will have to go to A8. So black now plays pawn to F5, king to C6, which threatens rook to B8. Black has to play rook to A8, king to B7. Black takes the pawn, and white takes back. Black plays F4. The key difference in this variation is that the black king is on G5 and not E5, and therefore the white king can come straight back and stop the pawn, and white wins this game by one tempo. White plays king to B6, pawn to F3, king to C5, pawn to F2. So black's done everything right. He's pushed his pawn first. Rook to B1, king to F4. But now importantly, I can play king to D4. And the black king has not stopped the white king from approaching the f-pawn. Now after king to F3, king to D3, king to G2, white can play king to E2 and stop the pawn from queening. White's going to win the pawn and reach king and rook against king. So the most important thing to remember about a rook and pawn endgame, when one side is going to queen first and win the opponent's rook, and then the other side is going to have a king and pawn against a rook, you really want to have your king on the same side as your opponent's king to stop him from coming back and getting your pawn. It's very important to remember to put your king on the central square to shoulder your opponent's king away to stop him from coming and getting your pawn. If you remember that piece of information and you ever reach a rook against pawn endgame, then I'm sure you'll find it much easier to find the correct drawing plan.
Yeah.